Hello and welcome to Class 9, Video 1. Class 9 is mostly going to be about arguments by analogy. However, I want to start with a quick lesson about a topic that we didn't have time to cover in Class 3 when we were covering evaluating arguments. And that concept is the burden of proof. We'll also be talking about standards of proof. So this video will cover burdens of proof and standards of proof. And the next two videos for Class 9 will cover argument by analogy. First, let's review a little. So in Class 3, when we were talking about evaluating arguments, we opened with a card sorting exercise, which let us realize that there were two separate important ways that an argument could go wrong. Some of the arguments that we looked at had false premises, generally ridiculous statements like all people are carrots. Other arguments we went wrong because the premises didn't hook up right with the conclusion. So even if the premises were true, they wouldn't imply that the conclusion is true. So this led us to say that whenever you look at an argument, there are two basic checks that you should run to evaluate the argument. One, you want to ask, are the premises true? Check the reasons. You also want to check the reasoning. If the premises were true, would they support the conclusion? So check the reasons, check the reasoning. The last check you want to run is to check for missing information. But this is a practical course, and that's an important part of this always is being sure that you've got the whole picture. So has any relevant information been omitted from the premises? And really, you should just make this a habit. This is a thing that you should do whenever you encounter an argument. All right. So we can think of these checks as questions you can ask. We call them critical questions in critical thinking. These are questions that you should ask once you have analyzed an argument by putting it in standard form. And actually, there are going to be some questions that we can ask of any argument you put in standard form, and then others that only go with certain forms of argument and their standard form. So, for instance, in this class, we're going to be covering argument by analogy. That's going to have a particular kind of standard form and a particular set of questions that go with it. So, the critical questions that we ask for any argument are just based on those three checks that I just mentioned. Are the premises true, or at least plausible? Do the premises support the conclusion enough, given the context? And has any relevant information been omitted from the premises? And like I said, there'll be more specific questions that we can ask about arguments by analogy. First, I want you to notice a bit of the wording here. So for the first question, I didn't just ask, are the premises true? I said, are they true or at least plausible? This is a practical course, and in the real world, we don't have an unlimited amount of time to verify the truth of any premise beyond any possible doubt. So rather than trying to be absolutely certain that the premises are true, we can actually just check to see if they're plausible. And there's another question lurking in the background here, which is how much time do you want to spend confirming the truth of the premises? And that's going to all depend on context and how much is at stake. And that's going to bring us to the concepts of burden of proof and standard of proof. But before we get there, just notice that the same thing, I've got the annotation on the slide now. The secondary question for plausibility. How important is this? How much time do I want to spend confirming the premises? And again, this is relevant for standards of proof. But the same thing happens with the second test. How strong does the inference need to be given the context? I emphasize that unlike validity, which is a black and white issue, strength comes in degrees. So you can always ask, is this strong enough? And again, this gets you to standards of proof. So this brings us to the main topic of the video, burden of proof and standard of proof. And these are concepts you might be familiar with from the law, or at least from lawyer shows and true crime shows. Burden of proof and the standard of proof. So one of the things that people will say all the time in the context of the US legal system is that you're innocent until proven guilty. That means that the burden of proof is on the prosecution. They are the ones who have to prove their case. In general, we say that the burden of proof is the obligation of one side of a debate to prove their case. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. They have to do it. And if the burden is not met, we say in American legal system that the defendant is innocent. We could also say that the case is undecided, but that's not the way we do it in the legal system. Either way, you can ask whether who has the burden of proof in any given argument? Whose job is it to prove their case? And like I said, in a criminal court case, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. The standard of proof is the amount of evidence that the party with the burden of proof must produce. And so again, this should be familiar with you. The burden from the US law, the burden of proof is on the prosecution, and the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. It is up to the prosecution to take on the burden of proof, prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Otherwise, the defendant is innocent. So there are other ways to handle standard of proof than the way the US legal system does. We already mentioned one, right? Deductive validity is a standard of proof. It is the standard of proof that is used in mathematics. And on this standard, there is no possible way for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So that's actually higher than the standard of proof that we get in legal court. And, that is because in real world situations, if you're not just talking about numbers, it's always possible to invent weird scenarios. The killer, I didn't do it. The person was killed by space aliens. That's not a reasonable doubt. That's an unreasonable doubt. The weird thing about math and pure logic is that they're not any more unreasonable doubts. It's all supposed to be deductive. So another standard of proof that I want you to be aware of is the preponderance of evidence standard. And this is actually weaker than the criminal court standard. This is the standard of proof that is used in civil trials, like lawsuits, when you're suing people for money. And here we just say that if the premises are true, the conclusion is more likely to be true than not. The preponderance of evidence, the majority of the evidence is on one side or another. 51%, roughly, right? Now, we're familiar with ideas of standard of proof and burden of proof from legal cases where they're fixed constitutionally. But in informal situations, we often lose track of where the burden of proof is. So a common tactic in informal argument, people arguing on the internet, people arguing in bars, ordinary circumstances, is for them to try and push the burden of proof off on you when it's not really on you. So this is really common with people who believe in unusual, things like UFOs or ghosts or paranormal phenomena, things that can't be tracked by science. They claim explicitly, this is beyond your science. The Ancient Aliens guy on the History Channel. the main tactic that they use is they shift the burden of proof from them to you. You can't prove that the pyramids weren't built by aliens. In general, the thing to do here is to just walk away from people who are daring you to disprove their crazy theory. I say that the president of the United States is a gray space alien. Well, the old slogan from Carl Sagan applies. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The burden of proof is on them, and the standard of proof is high. And if they're not going to do that, just ignore them. So this gives us two key fallacies that we keep track of in the traditional approach to critical thinking: burden shifting and appeal to ignorance. Burden shifting just is what I was describing. It's the fallacy that's committed when someone tries to dump the burden of proof on you when really it's on them. You can't prove me wrong. Appeal to ignorance is a specific kind of burden shifting where people say, well, it hasn't been proven true, so it must be false. And these definitions are not precise. They're mostly just here to point you to the general, a general warning. Don't let people push the burden of proof onto you. All right, so that's burden of proof and standard of proof, plus several examples of standards of proof. Next up, we're doing arguments by analogy. So first there'll be a reading, an exercise, and a video on the nature of arguments by analogy, identifying them, and then another reading, exercise, and video on analyzing arguments by analogy.